This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine, and we're not going to get 10 minutes into today's program before we find out what male honeybees are good for.
And their sole purpose in life will be flying around waiting to come across a virgin queen out on her mating flight. And if he should be so lucky as to come across a queen in flight, he'll mate with her, but in the process he'll have his reproductive organs ripped from his body, and then he'll crash to the earth dead.
It sounded pretty good right up to the last minute there.
Good up to that point.
I'm standing outside the home of Peter Cowan, the bee whisperer. There are 13 hives in front of me. There are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of honeybees in these little wooden boxes, all alive and well in these frigid temperatures. Out here, it's a cold January morning. Inside these hives, without any artificial insulation, the temperature is over 90 degrees. How do they do that? Why is honey still edible 3,000 years after it was made? How are honeybees different than bumblebees? I've got so many questions and just the right guy to ask. Bob Duchense's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. Peter Cowan has become quite well known in Eastern Maine. He teaches, he lectures, he writes occasional columns in the Bangor Daily News. He even comes to your house and removes swarms of bees you didn't want. For all that, you are now known as the bee whisperer. Peter?
Yes, for my sins.
Yes. Well, I wonder, is this like the Appalachian Trail where somebody else has to give you your name, or did it just come naturally to you? How'd you get the bee whisperer?
Yes, in fact, in this particular case, I was nicknamed the bee whisperer by a lady out in Lubec. I had a call. She'd had a swarm arrive at her house and moved into the wall of the house, and this poor lady was petrified of bees, named Shanna Wheelock. She's a great artist out there. And just in her just above her studio, in a brand new extension to the house, these 30,000 bees suddenly appeared and started to crawl into the still unfinished soffit area.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Yep, and they actually started to build a colony above her ceiling. And so when she gave me a call, she asked, "Am I the bee whisperer?" And I thought, I like that name. So that's how it came about.
Let's start with the basics. What is a honeybee?
Well, honeybee is a Maine state insect, and it's not quite domesticated, but it's been sort of looked after by man for many thousands of years. Originally, we were after the honey. Because the colony lives right through the winter, they actually have to store a lot of food. And in order to do that, they build a large colony, which is made of beeswax, and they store over 100 pounds of honey in the hive. And that made it very attractive because man could then get a source of sugar straight from by sticking his hand inside a hive, which came with a natural disincentive as well with all those bees. But then over the millennia, we've developed ways of taking the bees with us. So at first we were moving them around in straw skeps, which are like an upside-down basket where the bees would build their comb inside the basket. Problem is, with those, you'd have to tear them apart just to get the honey out. And it was in the middle of the 1800s that we started to make the first movable frame hives, where they encouraged the bees to build their combs in wooden frames, and then those combs could be moved around, and you could take the honey out without destroying the hive. And now all hives actually have to be movable frame hives, so you can take them apart without destroying the colony, and they can be inspected and checked for health and that sort of thing.
If my memory serves, honey was found in King Tut's tomb.
Yes, honey, and honey will last for thousands of years, if not forever. Basically, the bees make a super concentrated sugar in the form of honey, and it will not spoil as long as it's been cured properly and isn't exposed to air. It's going to last forever.
What makes honeybees different than other stinging insects, bumblebees, for instance?
Well, honeybees, as we're saying, they live in a very large colony, between 10 and 100,000 bees. Honeybee, typically during the summer, 50 to 70,000 bees. And unlike bumblebees, wasps, hornets, the honeybee will live in large numbers right through the winter time, and they'll actually generate a lot of heat in the hive. And when we go out and have a look at my hives, right now it might be 15 degrees outside, but in that colony it's over 90 degrees. And they'll get it up to 98 degrees in midwinter and start to rear young during the middle of the winter time. And so to do that, they have to store a lot of food because they have to burn a lot of calories to generate all that heat. And that's why they store well over 100 pounds of honey in some hives right through the winter time.
Well, what are they doing in there? Calisthenics?
No, they actually just sort of cluster together, and they some of the bees will just be vibrating their bodies and contracting muscles, and that will be generating heat.
That generates a lot of heat to get up to 98 degrees.
It does. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the honeybees will live in large numbers through the winter, whereas wasps and hornets and bumblebees, what will happen there is that the colony dies every winter. And the whole colony,
Queen and all?
with the exception of queens that have been born in the fall. They go out and mate, and then they'll overwinter in wood piles and piles of leaves. They'll bury themselves somewhere they can hibernate, and they won't wake up again until the spring, and they'll come out as an individual and start up a colony as one bee, maybe make about 6 cells, rear those young, and when those bees hatch, she has some helpers, and then when those 6 bees can raise maybe another 25 young, and then those 25 can then help the other 6 get a bigger colony, and gradually the colonies just get bigger and bigger and bigger through the summer, and then they produce a lot of queens in the fall, and then they die. And so that's the difference between them biologically.
So does the queen go into winter fertilized, or does she have to find
Usually, yes. Usually the queens will mate in the fall, and then winter is a fertilized female ready to go in the spring.
So it's good to be the queen.
Yes, she's the only one that'll live through a whole year. That's right.
All right, so back to honeybees then. It is one queen to a hive, but when I drove into your driveway, there's all bunch of boxes out there. Is that a colony? Is that one hive? How many queens are out there?
Well, each sort of tower, as it were, is one colony. So there's typically we'd have the entrance at the bottom, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes on the top, sort of like floors of a building. We'd call them supers. And just depends on, some of the colonies I'm overwintering have just 1 box. Most have 2, and 2 or 3 of them have 3. And it just depends on what my choices were in terms of overwintering that particular colony. If they didn't store the honey in the right place, I'd give them more room. And some colonies I'm overwintering as nukes, which are very, very small colonies. I'm doing some experimentation with them to overwinter smaller groups of bees, but they tend to still do pretty well through the winter time.
Bob Duchense's Wild Maine is coming to you from the home of Peter Cowan in Hamden. Peter is the bee whisperer. If you've got a bee question or a bee problem, he's the guy. Later in the show, we'll talk about some of his lectures and classes coming up. Maine is highly dependent on bees. Only one other state uses more bees for pollination than Maine does. Who and why? That answer is coming up on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Peter Cowan is the bee whisperer. Now, I'm on his couch in Hamden. Peter teaches, he lectures, he writes about bees. He even comes to your house and takes away bees that you didn't want, bees that decided to nest in your walls. Now, I understand that Maine is the second largest user of visiting pollinating bees.
That's right, yeah, second to California.
Yep, and the crop for California is what?
Almonds.
Almonds.
Yeah, February and March, they'll be bringing in about 1.5 million colonies to pollinate the almonds.
Yeah, I figured you'd know that, but I wanted to test you anyway. Let's see if I get the nomenclature right. The workers are all female.
Yes, they're all sterile females.
Yep. The males are drones, and there are probably some bees which are completely useless, which we call Congress.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the drones, they'll be the other sexually active bees. They are the the males, and their sole purpose in life will be flying around waiting to come across a virgin queen out on her mating flight. And if he should be so lucky as to come across a queen in flight, he'll mate with her, but in the process he'll have his reproductive organs ripped from his body, and then he'll crash to the earth dead.
It sounded pretty good right up to the last minute there.
Good up to that point. It was very good up to that point because they get fed, they get looked after by all his sister worker bees. But should he not find a queen bee, in the fall, the worker bees will turn on him and kick him out of the hive, and he'll starve to death or freeze to death in October, November time when he gets kicked out of the colony. So he's got a good life up to a point.
Boy, these bees are bastards.
Yeah, they're pretty ruthless. It's a ruthless life in there.
How fast can a healthy bee colony grow?
Well, provided with given warm conditions and a suitable size. If it's too small, they can't generate enough heat to keep the brood warm, so it would grow very, very, very slowly. May not even survive. But given a startup colony that would usually use something like a 3-pound package of bees. So most beekeepers will buy a 3-pound package of bees, which will contain about 12,000 bees. And that will go into a more or less empty hive, just a foundation to build their combs on. And the queen will start to lay eggs as soon as the combs are built. And it'll take 3 weeks for those eggs to hatch. And from that time, the colony's growth will start to increase quite rapidly. And the queen can lay up to 3,000 eggs per day. That's actually more than her own body weight in eggs per day. And so the colony, after 5 or 6 weeks, will be growing very, very quickly at 2,000 or 3,000 a day increase in number.
They must get to some kind of maximum point where it's time to swarm and start another colony somewhere.
That's right, yes. They will they would typically peak out at about 70, 80,000 bees. Sometimes it'll be more than that. But depending on how much space they have, it could be that if they filled the space in the colony and they're starting to bring honey in, there's a good flow of nectar coming in, and the queen is healthy, producing lots of brood, she starts to get very crowded out. And at that point, the colony will switch into a gear of reproduction called swarming. And what will happen then is that they will start to produce a lot of young queens in cells, or queen cells in the colony. And typically 20 or 30 young queens will be started in development, and just before those young queens hatch, the reigning queen, along with about half the worker bees, will fly out of the hive and go and settle on a branch of a tree somewhere and hang out in that area while scout bees go and look for somewhere for them to build a new colony. And those scouts will go out and check out all sorts of areas, hollow trees or your soffit in the house or a wall cavity. And once they find it, they'll come back and tell the others about it. They will go, and other bees will go and check it out. And they may find 7 or 8 different locations, and there will be a democratic process will go on, and they will eventually settle on one of those locations that they all favor and move to it. And in the meantime, back in the original hive, the young queens will start to hatch out. And the first one of those young queens to hatch out will immediately seek out her sister queens that are about to hatch, rip open the cell, and sting her sister to death. So another ruthless aspect of the colony's life there. Should 2 of them hatch at the same time, they'll fight to the death, basically.
Wow. Is there ever any circumstances where 2 queens can be in the hive at the same time?
Yes, on occasion. Sometimes a colony is big enough that one queen is in one part of the hive and the other queen is in the other part, and it takes them a while to come across each other. Very rarely there's a sort of a tolerance of that will go on for weeks. But usually one will kill the other pretty quickly. Beekeepers can also manage a hive so that they deliberately keep 2 queens in the hive, but they're separated by a barrier called the queen excluder, which is too narrow for the queen to fit in because she's pretty full of eggs, and so she's too fat to fit through the through the queen excluder. But the worker bees can pass to and fro through it, no problem. And as long as those 2 queen bees don't meet up with each other, then the colony can be producing twice as much brood and grow really quickly that way.
So the worker bees don't care which queen they're serving?
Not once they're used to her. They would do if you tried to put a new queen into a a colony that just, you'd say, it suddenly just lost its queen. You put a new queen in there, they'd turn on her and kill her straight away because they treat her like a foreign bee. But if she's in a little cage and you let the scent of that queen mix with the other bees for 2 or 3 days, and then you release her, then they'll be accepted, and the queen will take over the part that the previous queen had done, because the pheromones have been passed back and forth and the scents have mixed sufficiently that they don't recognize her as a foreigner.
Okay. So if you've got a bunch of hives out there, let's say in a blueberry field, they're separate queens, etc., I take it if they don't fight with each other.
No. They basically, one colony will, while the going is good, while there's lots of nectar coming in, one colony will keep to its own colony, and they will be going back and forth. They'll recognize which is their own colony, both by location and the smell, and if it's any different colors and things, it helps them identify their own location. But if it gets to the point where there's a food shortage, then they'll start to try to rob from each other. And that can get pretty brutal as well. And basically, bees will try to sneak in past the guards of their hive, and it starts to get pretty aggressive. And if you've got good, sound, solid beehives with pretty confined entrances, then there's no real problem. But if you've got old, rickety beehives with the lid's not on properly, or the two different floors of the supers aren't quite matching up properly, and bees can get in little cracks in the sides, then you get lots of activity where they're trying to sneak in past the guards, and then there'll be all sorts of fighting breaking out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do they have an A team and a B team?
Yeah.
Somebody must have used that pun in the past. How does pollen become honey?
Pollen doesn't become honey. Nectar becomes honey.
Okay.
Pollen. The bees get 2 things from the plants. Well, they get 3, in fact. They get nectar, and that's a dilute sugar syrup that the bees add enzymes to, because they suck it up into their honey stomach, add some enzymes to it, and they put it back into the cells, and then they evaporate it. They blow air, fan their wings, and blow air over it, and that gradually increases the sugar content by removing water content. So as opposed to nectar, the pollen is a high-protein substance. That's the male part of the flower, and the bees collect that as a high-protein that they feed to their larvae. And they'll mix the pollen with honey, and we call that bee bread. And that's fed to the developing larvae. They need that to feed their larvae as they're growing, whereas the adult bees will just be feeding on nectar or honey for the rest of their lives.
So it sounds like, and I was afraid of this, that it's almost like it's bee vomit. No.
Honey, no, it's, yes, it has been through the system of bees in that way, but it's a plant product, but the bees have added a little bit to it. That's right. Actually, the third thing that bees actually get from plants is it's a substance that they use to make glue. Bees make a glue called propolis, and they often get it from the buds of trees, and they actually seal up everything in the hive. And so, for instance, if they catch a mouse stealing honey from in the hive and they sting it to death, it's too big for them to cart out. They'll entomb the mouse in propolis, and it'll keep the hive sterile, and they'll cover rough surfaces, fill up cracks in the wood, and that sort of thing.
My guest is Peter Cowan, the bee whisperer. He handles a lot of bees, so later in the show, the obvious question will come up. Well, you've got all the safety gear, but even so, accidents must happen. How often do you get stung?
Well, because I do all sorts of weird things with bees, cutting colonies out of buildings and that sort of thing, I probably get stung.
Hey, what part of later in the program wasn't clear? This is Bob Duchenne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchenne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8. Today's show is coming from Hamden, where I'm sitting on the couch of Peter Cowan. You might know him as the Bee Whisperer. More and more Mainers are taking up beekeeping, and they're attending Peter's classes and lectures. Today's show is teaching me how little I know about honeybees. Well, the natural food for a honeybee then would be nectar. The natural food for a yellow jacket is an open can of root beer. Do honeybees ever devour anything else besides this one substance?
Oh, certainly, yeah. And as well, wasps will also, and yellowjackets will also eat insects. They're omnivores. They'll eat flesh as well as sweet stuff, whereas honeybees are purely vegetarian. And they will take any source of sugar that they can come across. And in some cases, there's interesting situations develop where there's an example in Germany. This beekeeper was finding his bees were producing blue honey. So he couldn't figure this out, why this bright blue honey was being stored in the hive. And it turned out that he lived quite close to what was the European equivalent of M&M factory. And the bees had come across the open trash skip in the back, and they'd been processing blue candy, and the bees had discovered the blue colored sugar. They went out, took that, brought it back to the hive, and they made it into a syrup, and basically they had blue honey. I think there's similar instances in New York with green honey as well, but basically they will take sugar, any source of sugar they can find, and that makes honey quite unique, because every hive makes a different flavored honey, because it just depends on what the sugar sources that they've come across, whether it was a combination of fruit trees and dandelions, or it was blueberries, or it was raspberries, or it was buckwheat or something. All of those honeys are very different from each other. They'll smell and they'll look different and they'll taste different.
So you've just discovered you've got a swarm in your attic. What happens now?
Right, well, usually it's actually in a more confined space in the attic. It'll probably be a soffit or a wall space or something like that. And then the thing to do is you call someone who's experienced in taking them out, because you want the bees have moved into an area. The first thing they'll do is start to build combs, and within weeks they can build dozens of combs, and they'll be starting to fill them up with young bees and honey, and they could store hundreds of pounds of honey in the walls prior to winter. And the problem is that sometimes the colony can die out, and given a little bit of time, they will die out, because we have all sorts of problems that causes the bees to die off, which we can talk about shortly. But and if that should happen, then you've got combs full of honey starting to collapse inside the walls, and you can have honey literally running out through the walls of the property given some time. And so it's always best to call someone like me, an experienced beekeeper, to remove them. It's not quite so straightforward. It's not like cutting a branch with a swarm on it and putting it into a box. You actually have to cut open or make access to the colony, and then start cutting out the bees. I use a specialized vacuum. Then I suck the bees into a bee box, and then you start to cut the combs out layer by layer. They build lots of parallel combs, and I'll attach those combs to wooden frames, usually with rubber bands or string, and then bit by bit you gradually work your way through the colony, cutting out combs, taking out more bees, cutting out more comb, taking out more bees, and gradually over an hour or two, or 3 or 4, depending on how big the colony is, we relocate them, and then we put the bees back with those combs and move them to a new area, and they'll repair them all and build the new colony. But if left to their own devices, the bees will first build a significant home inside your home. And then with time, they will gradually die off, and that will leave a real mess behind if you're not careful.
A couple of years ago, I was on the blueberry barrens in Colombia. I was just looking for some birds around some beehives, and for the most part, the bees won't bother you. I had this one bee that copped an attitude. He started chasing me around, and I'd sort of run a little bit, swat him off, get away. And, I'd be 20, 30 yards away, and he'd still come right back over to me, and all the other bees were leaving me alone. What was his problem?
Right. Well, first of all, it was a she.
Oh, she. What was her problem?
Well, these bees that have been reared commercially in those situations can some of them can be fairly aggressive. In fact, most of them being reared in places like Florida or Texas or the southern states. In some cases, when their queen was out mating, she'll mate with dozens of males before coming back, and then that's her done. She's mated that one flight, and that's her finish for her life. But she may have mated with an Africanized bee, or 2 Africanized bees, or 3 Africanized bees. And the Africanized bees are what's also known as the killer bees.
Right, yeah.
And they can be, that would mean a certain percentage of her young are fertilized by those males, which will inherit those aggressive characteristics. Now, you can have non-Africanized aggressive bees, but you can also have an element of Africanized bees mixed in with there, and they will be very persistent in terms of defending the colony. They perceive you as a threat, and they will try to intimidate you. They won't necessarily sting you, but they'll try to intimidate you and bounce off you, and eventually sometimes they will sting.
Yeah.
And they're looking to drive you away from the area.
It works.
Yes, it does work. It's remarkable how well it works as well. Even to a beekeeper, it doesn't like having a bee buzzing around and bouncing off his head.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, most beekeepers, hobbyist beekeepers, have quite gentle bees. You can get the occasional hive which goes aggressive for some reason. And in that case, it's usually best to requeen the hive. And so we'll actually find the queen in the hive and kill her, and replace her with a new queen, put her in with a cage, which will allow the scent to mix together, and within a few days you can release her, and her offspring will then be much more gentle.
On any given day when you walk out to visit the hives, do you detect that they're in a different mood?
Very much so.
There are mood swings.
Definitely. If the flowers are blooming, producing lots of nectar, the bees are as happy as can be. They're usually really gentle, and they're totally preoccupied with getting food in, as much food as possible while they can. If, say, a thunderstorm is impending, the bees will be much more agitated, and the behavior of the bees can totally change in the course of a few minutes.
Do they take it out on you?
They would take it out on you if you were working the bees. If you had the hive open at the time, then you'll start to detect they're getting more aggressive. They start getting jumpy, and the sound changes. It goes from a gentle hum to a higher pitched buzz. But generally, they'd be really calm. Now, if the nectar flow should stop, the bees also start to get more agitated. And it's interesting, if you are a beekeeper and you've got a field of buckwheat nearby, in the morning the buckwheat produces lots of nectar, and the bees are really, really busy getting all that buckwheat nectar in. It produces a very dark, very strong tasting honey, but the bees really work that buckwheat during the morning. And at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, buckwheat stops producing nectar, and suddenly the bees, which have been really busy all morning on the buckwheat flowers, suddenly find they've not got any food from those flowers, and they get pissed. And they let you know about it. They don't like you disturbing them if they've had their food source turned off like that.
Honeybees in bad moods and other surprises are the subject of Bob Duchense's Wild Maine today. Peter Cowan, the bee whisperer, is my guest. Earlier in the program, I promised to ask the obvious question: how often do you get stung? The wait is over. The answer is next. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. I'm Bob Duchesne, host of Bob Duchense's Wild Maine, and today's show is about honeybees. Peter Cowan is the bee whisperer. He keeps his own bees, he teaches people to raise their own bees, and even comes to your house to remove unwanted bees. He personally handles a lot of bees. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Well, you've got all the safety gear, but even so, accidents must happen. How often do you get stung?
Well, because I do all sorts of weird things with bees, cutting colonies out of buildings and that sort of thing, I probably get stung 2 or 3 times a week. But I'm dealing with lots and lots of bees, and I wear a full bee suit, but they'll sting me through the gloves or something like that. And during the honey flow, during the spring, I might not get stung at all. But I'm working the bees during all sorts of times, whether there's a honey flow on or not, and I've got to manage a lot of bees.
So do you get used to it, or do you say every time, damn?
Yeah, you do get used to it. If you get stung in your hands, it doesn't really bother bother me at all. If I occasionally get a bee inside my veil, that bothers me. You get a bee buzzing around there, and you just know before you get that veil off, it's going to get you.
Yeah.
That I don't like at all. But that's pretty rare.
Yep. Now, let's say somebody wants to get into beekeeping. How do you determine if your property is even suitable?
In most cases, there's a shortage of bees. And so in most cases, bees are going to do well in most areas. And part of the lessons that we do in terms of saying where's the best place to locate your bees within your given surroundings. Now, some people have very small yards, and it might be more convenient to locate their bees on a rooftop or on top of a garden shed or something like that. But generally they occupy very little space, but it's where the bees fly that can determine how much footprint they have in your yard. But you can always put a little bit of a fence around it and encourage the bees to fly up instead of across your yard. You shouldn't stick your beehive next to the neighbor's fence so that they're flying out over the neighbor's yard. That's not really fair. But there's we go through all the different things in the beekeeping classes. The sort of things: where do you get the equipment? Where do you buy the bees? What equipment you need?
Could you just set up frames without the bees, and maybe some bees will find it?
Yes. In fact, I do put out swarm traps, and basically it's like a miniature hive with a comb or two inside, and I usually bait that with one or two old combs, which bees find really attractive to move into, and usually a couple of drops of lemongrass oil, which is sort of like a mimic to the queen substance or one of the queen's pheromones. And that baiting the hive like that, the bees smell it, and if there's a swarm within a mile or so, they're looking at the scouts out there looking for new locations. They'll smell those things and they'll check out that. And quite often I'll catch a swarm that way. So putting out combs is a way, but it needs to be in a confined space. So it needs to be sort of in a box. And
So let's say you are a beekeeper. Is there something you can do to your yard, plant certain flowers that make it more attractive and better?
Certainly. The diversity of food sources is really important for the bees. And I'd say the first thing that you could do to help bees most is not put down things like weed and feed things. Your lawn is a potentially huge asset to bees. In the spring, you get dandelions, and dandelions are the biggest single most important food source for the bees during early spring. Then later in the year is the clovers, and the white clover in a lawn is probably the biggest supply of honey for the bees through the summer. And so the first thing is to help bees is don't eliminate those from your lawn if you can help it. Now, if you really need a weed-free lawn, look around the edges of the lawn and try to plant food that bees and other pollinators can make use of. A variety of wildflowers, particularly ones that are flowering throughout the whole spring, summer, fall period, because there's certain times of year when there's relatively little food for the bees. And that'll make a big difference to the bees. So the more diverse food sources they can get, the healthier they'll be. This is one of the reasons that commercial beekeeping, bees moved around from one monoculture to the next. They struggle with only getting one type of pollen, because it'd be like us trying to feed our kids only hamburgers for 4 weeks, or only cabbages for 2 weeks. You need a variety in the diet, and the bees likewise feeding their larvae with pollen, a variety of pollen, very helpful for them to produce healthy young, helps them resist other problems.
What mistakes can you make as a beekeeper?
There's a number of different things. First of all, the most important, most common thing is feeding the bees when they're first started. When you first start a colony, they've got no combs, and they need about 7 pounds of food to make 1 pound of beeswax. And bearing in mind they have to build their entire system of combs in there, they have to eat quite a bit of food to do that. And so feeding is the most important thing, feeding them a sugar syrup. And during the spring, we'll feed them a 1 part sugar to 1 part water mixture, which simulates a nectar flow. And the bees will feed on that, and that'll allow them to produce comb more quickly, and they'll grow quite quickly. And I tell my beginners to feed them until they've built those first 2 stories of the hive. They've built all the combs in there, and that usually takes them a couple of months. Then the next most important thing is probably watching for the parasitic mites. Mites are a problem that came to this country in the mid-'80s and spread like wildfire around colonies around the country. And it's a parasite which sucks the juices out of the developing larvae as they're growing and will kill, not necessarily kill the larvae, but make it very weak. Just the parasitic bite will reduce the life of the bee significantly, reduce its body weight by about 25% and make the bee much weaker. But it also introduces bacteria and viruses which then make the bee weaker still, and then the whole colony just gradually diminishes, having more and more weak bees, and then it succumbs to other problems, and they can't produce enough food, they'll starve to death over the winter, or generally just not be strong enough to keep the colony warm through the winter time.
Keep the colony warm through the winter time. Now, I'm in the home of the bee whisperer, Peter Cowan, and as I look out his window, there are hives just sitting out there in the yard. No heat, no insulation, and yet there are probably a few 100,000 honeybees sitting outside on a January morning. It's about time we went out and took a look at how that's even possible. Coming up, as Bob Duchense's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine. If it is outdoors fun and adventure, sooner or later, it's going to end up on this show. A lot of people garden in Maine, and more people are gardening better. Some people are getting into beekeeping in their own backyards. Peter Cowan is my guest. He is the bee whisperer, and lately he's been crazy busy teaching people how to be beekeepers. There are courses offered at local colleges. There are lectures. Take it away, Peter.
Right. First of all, there's all sorts of, if they're out of the region that I'm teaching beekeeping, they should go to mainebeekeepers.org. That's the Maine State Beekeepers Association website, and there'll be a list of the different beekeeping schools they can go to. I'm working with local adult education authorities, and so I'm doing classes in 9 different regions with the adult ed. So you can go to your local adult ed and see if there's a beekeeping course going on there. And if you're in places like Bangor, Hampden, Ellsworth, Orono, Newport, Belfast, Howland, Pittsfield, Sullivan, I can't remember if this in Bucksport. If you're in one of those areas, I'll be doing a beekeeping for beginners course and maybe an intermediate beekeeping course there. But if you check mainebeekeepers.org or just check with your local adult education authority, if they're not giving a beekeeping class, you can ask them to. Now, I'm fully booked up, but there are other beekeepers that can give those classes. But they usually cost about $45 for a 3 lesson course. It's 3 2-hour lessons on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday evening. And I'm starting my first ones in late January and going right on until June. And then I start again in September, October, November time.
When would you want to start beekeeping as a beginner? Would you wait till spring, or can you do it now?
It's best to start preparing now because you'd start the bees in April or May or June, but you'd want to know what you're doing, get your equipment sorted out, and in particular order your bees, because there's always a shortage of bees in the spring. So you have to, if you are ordering a package of bees, you'd want to get your order of a package in. They usually cost about $125 for a package of bees.
I have to ask, do these package of bees come in the mail, or
No, we're bringing in, I'm working with Harold Swan at Swan's Bee Supply, and we're bringing in 200 packages of 3-pound packages of bees. They're trucked up, and we'll have them available. Also, the other way of getting bees is with a nuke. It's an already established colony of 5 combs, and they have been grown for a little while, maybe over winter time as well. And they would typically cost more like $155 or so, but that's a slightly more established colony where the bees have already got larvae in there. There'd be about the same number of bees as a package would be, but you've got maybe 20,000 larvae developing there as well, and they've already got a few combs built.
So it sounds like you can get into beekeeping for something like $400, $500.
Yeah, probably a little less than that. You could but that's probably a good round figure. Gradually, you want to expand and make the colonies bigger, and we do recommend you try to start with 2 colonies if you can. But yeah, and it's an awful lot of fun as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there people out there who just want more bees?
Yeah, I'd
say want the biggest colony they can get.
Yeah. It's a mixture. I always ask why people are taking the course. A lot of folks are just interested in bees, and they want to see what they can do to help, because they know bees are in trouble out there. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks want to increase the productivity of their farm or their garden, and a lot of folks want to produce honey. Mm-hmm. We all like to produce some surplus of honey. And it's just really interesting. It's actually just so amazing opening up a colony in the spring and just seeing all the activity going on there. And most generally speaking, the bees will take absolutely no notice of you when you've opened up the colony. And they're just going about everything, especially when there's a good honey flow going on. It's just so interesting to seeing everything that's going on there. You've got tens of thousands of insects brains the size of a pinhead, all working together, all working like one super organism. It really is a fascinating thing to
And wouldn't
to
the world
watch.
be a better place if we sweeten everything with honey instead of high fructose corn syrup?
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Okay, time to head outside and take a winter look at these bee colonies. I'm at the home of my guest, Peter Cowan, the bee whisperer. This is in Hamden. There are beehives right in the front yard. They're just sitting there, and I'm dying to know how bees can stay warm all winter just sitting there. No heat, no insulation, nothing to keep the snow off, just sitting there. Okay, we're outside in the yard. We're heading towards the bees. This is one time of year where I can walk up to the hives and not worry about getting swarmed, I presume.
That's right, yes. We've got 13 colonies overwintering here right now. Mm-hmm. Some are the nukes and some are the full-size hives. These taller ones, which are 2 or 3 boxes high, they'll have a cluster in there of maybe 15 to 20,000 bees.
In each one of these?
In each one, yep. The smaller ones, there's small, thinner ones, these overwintering 2-story nukes. They probably have more like 5 to 10,000 bees in them. Mm-hmm. But they will, once the weather starts warming up a bit, the end of February, they'll start to raise some young in there, and they'll really bring the temperature up to the high 90s and start rearing their young. Right now, the temperature in there might be in the around about 90 degrees.
And it doesn't look insulated.
Nope. In fact, what I generally do, I used to insulate the hives, but these hives here are located so that they get lots of sun. Mm-hmm. And if they get lots of sun, the best thing then is to paint them a dark color, mm-hmm. which most of these are. And in fact, that radiant energy of the sun on the hive will really warm those hives up very quickly. And that really helps the bees to move around on the combs, because the biggest problem that they face when it's really cold is that they can't move from one comb to another. Mm. But with the sun on the hive, they can then generally move around and get to where the food is. Mm-hmm. Also on the hives, you see the entrances have the wire mesh over them to stop mice getting in. And they've got an entrance near the top, so that if they're buried 2 feet deep in snow, they can still get out of the hive if it gets to be a warm day. And if we get the sun on them and it's about 40 degrees, the bees will be starting to fly, as they need to get out to go to the bathroom. Mm-hmm. And generally, if it's 50 degrees, there'll be a lot of bees flying around for a couple of hours.
So you can see bees in January out here.
Oh, yeah. In fact, last week we had a lot of bees flying around Christmas, and they were all over the place here. All the hives had lots of bees outside them. But now it's in the teens. They're tucked up good and tight now.
So let's say we get a nor'easter and 2 feet of snow. What do you have to come out here and do right away?
Absolutely nothing.
Really?
Everything that needs to be done has been done. Mm-hmm. The bees have all the food that they could fit in the hive during the fall, mm-hmm. and they've got an upper entrance, and they've got the mouse guards on. So all we can do is cross our fingers and wait for spring until maybe a little later, around in late February and March, I'll be checking the weight of the hives to make sure that there's still enough food in there. And if the hive is really lightweight, I'll open it up and put some food in at the top.
Now, this time of year, maybe I wouldn't see it, but in the spring, would you have these surrounded by electric fence, or do you just not worry about bears?
Well, here, where I am in Hampden here, I've not got an issue with bears. Having said that, last spring, on the other side of Hampden, I had 7 hives turned over by a bear. And so I didn't use that yard. This is the first time I'd used that yard, and I didn't have a bear fence around them. So I didn't go back to that yard this year. But right now, where I keep my bees, I don't have a bear issue. But if you do, then electric fence is the way to keep the bears off.
How are you bearing up? The theme music means the show is over. We're out of time, but you can expect a return visit this summer when these hives right here are buzzing with activity. Today's show has been coming to you directly from the Hampden home of Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. If you want to know what Peter is up to, his website is beewhisperer.us. beewhisperer.us. One way to catch up is to circle February 20th on your calendar. That Friday night, Maine Audubon will host a lecture by Peter Cowan at the Sea Dog in Bangor. It's called Bees and Brews, and yeah, beer will be involved. Bob Duchense's Wild Maine airs twice every weekend, Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and Sunday morning at 8 a.m. And it's archived with all the previous shows on the website at 929theticket.com. Bob Duchense's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.